So, good noon and weekend time for people. This is Tom Gutheil, I have the honor of introducing long-term colleague Dr. Harold Burstein, who's been at MS Metal and other systems locally for many, many years. I need to give a little history here. I first met him in 1974 as a medical student, and then as a resident, and then as a colleague, and then as a co-author, and then as a co-founder of the program. So this is a bond closer than brotherhood. But an even closer bond is based on the fact that most people don't get my last name or his last name correct. The first name, mine, they don't grasp the Austrian pronunciation. And of course, his is a mouthful of Polish consonants. So these are some of the things that bond us closely. And it's my pleasure to introduce him for today's presentation, which, among other things, featured his ability to connect clinical material with cultural issues on a wider scale. And I think this is one of his significant strengths, and look forward to hearing from him on this presentation.
Tom, thank you so very much for that wonderfully playful and thoughtful introduction, as always. Today, my topic will be the art of bioethical resilience in the midst of grief and fear, and certainly being playful and thoughtful is very much part of that art. And Angie, thank you for coordinating everything. You are our guide to those of us who are technologically perplexed and still children of the 20th century. Very much appreciated for all your efforts, Angie, for keeping education within the Massachusetts mental health care system, a system to which I first came in 1976 as a student, and then proceeded to my residency here. You may ask why bioethical and why resilience. I think in the midst of the pandemic, you probably will not ask in the midst of grief and fear. We've seen enough of this.
Yeah.
In a fundamental way, I'm returning to a topic which I first began to in 2020 at the Grand Rounds here in October. But at that point, the pandemic was about a month old or so. Today, we are coming up on this second anniversary. By the way, if you're not speaking right now, please mute yourself. That will be very, very helpful. Thank you. In part, it's the difference between an acute stress disorder and a chronic stress disorder, and acute grief and chronic grief. But that's a little bit too simplistic. What has been happening is something which is complex, and yet it has happened before. And it has happened before in history. It's been depicted via art and different kinds of art. And then what happens next in terms of how do we bounce back? That's the resilience part. Do we bounce back in a healthy way? That's the bioethical part. Or do we bounce back in a more toxic way? A way which has happened all too often subsequent to the pandemics. And how do we bounce back individually, in terms of family context? How do we bounce back socially and culturally in terms of community context? And what better place to talk about this than the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, which is all about community mental health. And community mental health, which very often focuses on those people who have had tragic, chronic, major mental illness in their life or other forms of major loss. So again, in a sense, this is a continuation. Today's date is particularly meaningful to me. As I mentioned a few years ago when I gave Grand Rounds in January, January, especially January 19th, is particularly meaningful for me in terms of my own family history, because this is the date that the Russian army liberated Lodz. And this is the date where my family, together with 12 other people who had hidden in a sewer, in a gutter basically, for over 6 months, finally emerged. But again, what happened then? This is in World War II, this is 1945. What happened subsequently? How did some people rebound in a healthy way? How did some people rebound in a toxic way? And why in one direction or the other? That's part and parcel. The what I'd like to focus on in particular is what can we learn from art? What can we learn from art about bioethical resilience in the midst of grief and fear? And what can we learn in terms of that will be useful to us today in terms of supporting our ability to be creative, and can we learn in terms of tomorrow, in terms of our supporting the process, which will, my guess is, go on for many years subsequent to this pandemic, hopefully beginning to peter out up the road. I hope that I don't have to go ahead in a couple of years and return to this subject again in this particular way, although I have one way or the other, I think we will continue to be talking about it. I'm going to try to move these slides here, which I'm told I can do this way. Let me just see how to move these slides. So let's see. Okay, I'm being technologically tutored here by Jason. And to move these slides, I need to scroll this. Let's. Oh,
maybe arrows at the bottom.
Yeah, here we go. No. Jason's my guide to the technically perplexed. Here's we're looking now at the two slides. One of them, the one on the left, is by Albrecht Dürer. Dürer lived in Nuremberg in Germany, and in 1490, 94 to 96, a plague hit Nuremberg. Dürer decided to take his family and he went to Venice. But then he came back to Nuremberg in 1498, and he proceeded to do this etching, which some of you are no doubt familiar with. This is the etching of the four horsemen from the Apocalypse, one of the books in the
That's fine, Steve. Don't worry about it. I need to.
Please mute. Can you please mute yourself, because we can all hear you, and perhaps we can save any comments for later on. Thank you. Please mute. Do those four horsemen of the apocalypse represent his way of trying to both deal creatively with the aftermath of the pandemic, the Black Death pandemic, but also a way of trying to go ahead and deal transgenerationally. It's being done for him, and it's being done so that not only he not feel alone, but also it's being done for future generations. Dürer had a very much of a sense of future generations. The quote from Dürer is as follows: "This is the panic we will remember when all seems lost." Now, in terms of that particular etching, you will notice on the far right the fellow with the arrow. Can everyone see the fellow with the arrow on the right here? That particular fellow is meant to be pestilence, and you will notice that pestilence is the leading horseman. Again, please mute yourself. Thank you. The leading horseman here. Again, I'm not sure. Maybe we can mute everyone at this point except Tom and myself. If we can do that, that might be helpful. Thank you. Maybe we can't quite do that. Let me see here. Maybe I can mute.
Susan Berger, you're coming through to the large audience Would you mind muting yourself so that we can have the grand rounds that is scheduled for this slot? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we have postulates here leading the way. Art is not atemporal. It includes time. And again, where one leads, the hostman that leads is the hostman that can kill you from afar, which is the idea of a Black Death. Next to him, right next to him, is the horseman with the sword upraised. And that horseman is woe. Woe itself is considered to be a plague. And then next to him, following him, is the horseman who is usually meant to represent famine. Again, another cause of death. None of these, by the way, have yet been banished from the world. No has been the horseman that's closest to us. That horseman at the bottom, the horseman of death. This image, one way or another, does come up at different times. Sometimes it's individual horsemen, sometimes it's multiple horsemen. Here in 1942, we have Henry Moore, a British sculptor and artist, painting a coal miner in the dark during Britain's darkest hour. He's reacting to Roe. But what's the difference between these two slides? Here, there is almost no. The only savior is up above, the angel that's up above here in the Dureau slide. In the Henry Moore slide, what we have is a coal miner who has a light. So again, in each instance, there is some light, there is some hope, there is some possibility for resilience. And that's not to be underestimated by any stretch of the imagination. Well, I began by saying,
okay? If you want to be seen, you hit the video. I can hear you now.
Again, what is different now from the pandemic of 2020? Well, for one thing, we now have more healthcare, more visibility of the healthcare inequities that cause higher death rates among poor people, people of color, among many of the marginalized populations. Secondly, we have a greater awareness of the effects of COVID-19. And not only the short-term effects, but the long-term effects, as well as the isolation, the measures we've taken, the potential iatrogenic costs of trying to treat COVID-19 in a public health manner and an individual manner. We also have the widespread vaccine hesitancy, which has become more and more coalesced. We have both patient and staff demoralization. This is after 2 years. People seem to be more divided rather than united in terms of community. We have a greater degree of survival guilt, and we have more identification with the aggressor. In a sense, we are now teetering between whether we will have a bad normalization as COVID proceeds and recedes, or a good normalization, whether we will have toxic resilience or bioethical resilience. And this is a tale yet to be told. So how can art help us to address the effects and the ravages of time and grief? As I mentioned before, as we saw from that Dureau etching, visual art is not atemporal. Our eye moves across the picture. It begins at a place, usually the leading edge, and ends in a place. Begins with the Black Death, goes through war and famine, which often follow plagues, by the way. So this is not a etching which is being composed in haste or atemporally, and which often ends in death. That's what's eventually closest to us. Now, what can we do to go ahead and move towards healthy resilience? Part of it is to find a way to maintain perspective, again, something which art very much teaches us, a way to address time and to move from the unconscious, which is timeless and which reflects our more primitive reactions, to the temporal, to time, to the conscious. So we can go ahead and make conscious choices under conditions of uncertainty, and hopefully choices which are reflective of our perspective, which is not only short term, what is most convenient at a given time, but longer term and long term. Choices which reflect our better angels, the light on top of the forehead of the minor, the rare angel floating above the four horsemen, rather than the four horsemen themselves, rather than the coal mine in which the coal miner in 1942 is laboring, the coal mine of the darkness of civilization. At this point, let me go ahead and play some music which to me reflects what's captured by Turner in 1843 in his Norway series of watercolors, and which is also captured in many ways by Langston Hughes when he is reacting to the long history of American racism, slavery, in his poetry. So what you hear next is a song played to a composition by Jason Hoffman. Full disclosure, he is my office manager and composes me a good deal of the time, and which is part of our Bioethics and Culture Institute, which is a meditation, how to move into spaces which are safe spaces, how to maintain perspective in the midst of darkness. And the words are just below here on the slide. Tonight we march, waves march in long ranks, cutting the darkness with their silver shanks, cutting the darkness and kissing the moon, beating the land's edge into a swoon. So again, think of the four horsemen, think of Henry Moore's kid, minor in the darkness, and as you listen to what follows now. Let me just move this back here. Yeah, so, oops, okay. Here we go. Now, but we just got back to the beginning.
March in long ranks, cutting the darkness with their silver shanks, cutting the darkness and kissing the and beating the land's edge into a swoon.
So how can we maintain that perspective when confronted with what today's turmoil? On the right here, we have Hyman Bloom's painting. Again, by full disclosure, I knew Hyman Bloom, who is a Boston-based American painter since 1972, first introduced. And here, this particular painting by Hyman Bloom was his called Seascape Tree, was his homage to Turner's Slave Ship, which is at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And I would go ahead and very much recommend that for those of you who haven't seen it to see it there. Turner's protest against slavery and Bloom's protest against the predatory aspects of human nature as found in slavery is still reflective of today's reality. How do we put these two pictures together? How do we maintain perspective? Well, again, even in Bloom's picture, there was a temporal notion here. See the letter B at the very right of this particular painting. Bloom rarely signed his paintings. This was about as close as he got to signing a painting voluntarily, as opposed to under duress when his buyer said, "You have to sign my painting." And there's a little B in the midst of this predatory sea. And yet, again, it's maintaining perspective, maintaining a sense of time, not only the short term, what's called by people like Danny Kahneman, um, uh, type 1 thinking, but also the long term, type 2 thinking, that even in the midst when being faced with tragedy, when our survival is at stake, we need to be able to maintain perspective. We need to be able to go ahead and not only focus on the short term, but also on the long term. And again, there's various ways of doing that. I know in the autumn, Kesh talked about how art can be very helpful in terms of just view yourself of an artist. But for those of us who are not artists ourselves, myself included, being able to go ahead and use art, being able to use visual art, being able to use music, temporal art to maintain our perspective, to make sure that we are not just focused on the short term, is absolutely vital in the midst of this pandemic. So, in terms of artistic representations of grief and fear in the midst of the pandemic and models of bioethical resilience, we have here a representation by Rembrandt of Adam and Eve. Now, Rembrandt, as I'll touch on soon, himself suffered a great deal of grief, a great deal of loss, and he was very conscious of the idea that somehow in an earlier time we had utopia. And this is Rembrandt's depiction here on the um, on the left of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. But look, not everything is absolutely hunky-dory, and even in utopia itself, in the Garden of Eden, there is the snake, and the expressions on Adam's face and Eve's face, they're not exactly super happy expressions. At the same time, we do not want to go ahead and discourage curiosity, but the nostalgia for going back to the way things were before the pandemic, that's kind of perfectionism. It's simply not going to be possible. So we have to grieve that. We cannot go back to the way things were before the pandemic. We cannot go back and be compensated for lost time. Individually, as a community, we need to find ways to go ahead and to grieve for what's been lost, but grieve about what's been really lost, not some utopian vision of what's been lost. Things were really wonderful under Obama, Trump, before the pandemic, you name it. It just ain't so. Things were not all that wonderful to begin with. There was still a variety of social injustices, inequities, people acting in a predatory fashion. We have to recognize what human nature has been ever since the Garden of Eden. And part of that recognition involves, here's a drawing by Hyman Bloom from 1953 called Marseillas Flayed, which was exhibited in an exhibition of Bloom's work at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 2019, before the pandemic, right? Before the pandemic hit. In fact, I believe it was just as the pandemic started that exhibition ended. But Marseillas was a starter who was incredibly competitive with everyone in terms of his musical abilities. He could go ahead and just claim he could be better than anyone else. And he eventually started competing against himself in some sense, or at least in the Greek myth, against the Greek god of Apollo, and challenged Apollo to a contest. Who could be the better musician? Who could be the better flautist? And Apollo initially declined, but eventually said, okay, I will accept this, but if you lose, I get to flay you alive. Well, Marseillas lost, because when you're competing against yourself, when you're competing against a vision of yourself from 2019, and you're now in 2022, again, there's no possible way that you can win. So again, using our younger selves as standards, the pre-pandemic selves as standards to which we want to go back to individually or as a community, is really asking oneself to be flayed alive. That kind of perfectionism is asking oneself to be flayed alive. And I'll touch on this a little bit more later, but that kind of perfectionism may be part of the so-called vaccine hesitancy. Somehow, if the vaccine doesn't protect you totally, then it's poop. Oh, if it can have some low risk of side effects, then somehow it's absolutely no good. But the perfect hero, to paraphrase Voltaire, is truly the enemy of the good. Voltaire and Winnicott. If we all get stuck in this kind of perfectionism, as Hyman Bloom depicts in Marseilles Played, we eventually wind up where Don Quixote and Sancho Panza wound up. This is a Picasso print, which is very well known, quite popular, and for good reason, because it shows that to dream the impossible dream has a huge amount of cost to it. We need to dream, but we also need to realize when our dreams are impossible. And this is true for us individually, when we work clinically with patients, for us as a community as well. Again, all of this is a lot easier said than done, and each of these could be a session in itself. Part of what has been lost at this point, and again, I'm going to begin with, I'll be moving from left to right here, is the denial of aging and entropy. This was the grand aunt of one of Bloom's wives, who he depicted. But what was amazing about Bloom was that he basically was able to look at aging and entropy and recognize it for what it is, and at the same time show that one can maintain some sense of dignity. She's looking out at us, even in the midst of aging and entropy. So how to acknowledge what's been lost, how to at the same time maintain one's dignity and sense of agency. She's looking at you. She's not helpless. The subject here is not helpless. Now contrast this with Kate Kalowitz's etching here. And in this particular etching, what we have is two mothers and two children. And the mothers are having one hell of a time, but the children are absolutely helpless. The usual kinds of separations that exist between and separation processes that exist between mothers and children, fathers and children, here's Abraham and Isaac, have become that much more jagged, that much more ambivalent with the pandemic, the threat of the fear and grief which often preoccupies, the kind of choices that parents have to make, as Abraham does with Isaac, tragic choices. Not to kill your kid, although you may feel that way sometimes, but to have to go to work and who's going to watch the kid at the same time? Or when you're at home, working from home, and your kid wants to go ahead and play with you, what do you say? Do you sacrifice the child at that point? Or do you go ahead and sacrifice your work? So the usual sorts of parent-child separation issues which go on, both socially and intrapsychically, have become much more tragic feeling. They've been much more in the shadow of grief and death. And I think, again, that's something which has to be recognized. It's not business as usual. And bad news, it will not be business as usual as we go on. I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but that would be an illusion. So what will not be the same again? Halloween, for example, or a masquerade ball. This is now 20 years after the Black Death pandemic in Nuremberg, showing us a ball where some people have masks on, and everyone is happy, but not everyone has masks on. And if you look at it carefully, not everyone is that super happy anymore. Not that, again, masks per se were used, but people put cloths over their mouths when they were disposing of the dead during the Black Death. So some idea of masking even then was available. And of course, by the time we get to Goya in 1798, when we have the uh, the, uh, the third horseman, well, just on the horizon, and those we had, masks become, rather than a symbol of pleasure and fun, become what that everyone has had to become guarded, especially in the face of the Spanish Inquisition in full bloom at that particular point in time, with Napoleon hovering in the wings. So again, will masks ever mean the same to us? And will social masks ever mean this? Or will we all wind up wearing social masks as a result of feeling that that's the only way to protect ourselves and to contain the kind of grief and fear that we experience? At this point, it's a question I don't have the answers to. Now, what followed is after uh, the uh, after war in Spain is what often follows after pandemics. Um, on the left here, we have Goya's depiction in 1815 of the Inquisition coming back, worlds, the clergy, the self-righteous beginning to go ahead and beat the drum. Will we have this? Uh, well, we can see it to some extent at this point. Uh, when people are making such horrendous misanalogies as comparing vaccine mandates uh, to, to Nazism. I mean, it boggles one's imagination that that kind of inquisition that that, that has gone. And will we also, as by Otto, that's in 1922. Now, 1922 is important because we have Germany losing World War I, and we have the influenza, the Spanish flu, so-called Spanish flu, uh, which was between 1918, 1919, 1921. Probably unfair to Spain, by the way, but it's another issue. And what Arthur Dix is showing is the wish to have a strong leader here. She's supposed to be a wild animal tamer. Well, that wish came true 11 years later, in 1933. Uh, now, uh, those who have actually researched who voted for Hitler in 1933 have shown that the best predictor of, of those parts of Germany that voted for Hitler the most in 1933 were those parts which were most affected by the Black Death pandemics in the 1400s. You could make that was the best correlation you could find in terms of regions of Germany that were most supportive of Hitler and Nazism early on. So this is a gift that keeps on giving. We drop a pebble into the water, and there is a variety of transgenerational reverberations. So this is something which will need to be followed, will need to be monitored, both individually and also, and individually in terms of, you know, at this point, I'm beginning to hear more and more family history of how people reacted in uh, uh, after World War II, how people reacted uh, after the Spanish flu among some of my patients. It's worth exploring that with patients, the kind of transgenerational um, reactions to grief, loss, and how do people become resilient again? Will we become resilient by moving towards an inquisition, either socially or internally? Or will we become resilient by moving towards authoritarianism, even either internally, becoming extremely rigid and nitpicky, or uh, 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 moving towards the more predatory versions, as depicted in Hyman Bloom's. Now, ideally, what we would want, ideally, what's the ideal? But again, it has to be noted as an ideal, is a sense of being able to reflect. But here on the left is another etching by Rembrandt in 1652 of a scholar in his study. And again, if anyone knew of grief, and it was Rembrandt who had multiple losses, wives, children. And for Rembrandt, at this point, the only uh, the place to find reflection, to find peace, to find perspective is in the solitude of his study. Note the light again, the same angel that we find in Durrell, the same light that we find in the coal mine. This is where we find solitude, but it's in isolation. Now contrast this with Hyman Bloom in the 1960s. Bloom himself did not lose any direct family in the Shoah, but there were a more extended family who were murdered in the Shoah. And over the course of our many years of conversation with each other, he told me this was his favorite rabbi painting. He painted many rabbis. He wanted to be a rabbi originally. That was his reaction to grief, including some childhood grief, a stillbirth, and so on. But this particular rabbi is someone who's holding on to knowledge, and he's even being guarded by some lions. The lions were the symbols of the butchers that guarded Jewish communities in after after the Black Plague, when there were pogroms. The Jews were being accused of the Black Death. So he's being guarded here. He's holding on to knowledge, though. And even though he's frightened, he's not letting go of knowledge. Another reaction, another way of seeking resilience, is in the paintings of Henrik Epstein. He was a painter from my hometown, Lodz, Poland. I came here at the age of 9, but I only learned about him more recently. He moved to Paris when he was a teenager after his father's death, became friends with Modigliani and Picasso, both of whom admired him. In 1944, he was murdered by the Nazis for being Jewish. But what he's depicting here is an owl, and an owl that's on one hand surrounded by sparrows, and on the other hand, there's flowers. There's some sense of beauty, and there's a book here. Now, the owl, we always think of in Greek terms as being a symbol of wisdom, Athena, right? No. In fact, after the Black Plague, it was used as a symbol of Jews who supposedly were ravenous and who were attacking the little sparrows, the non-Jewish community, because of the wide disparity in the number of deaths during the Black Death between the Jewish and the non-Jewish community. The best way to understand the disparity is that the Jewish community at that time had a very serious hand-washing ritual where you would say a prayer before every meal. That cut down the incidence of Black Death, but instead it was translated into the Jews, the owls, poisoning wells and praying and so on. Well, here he shows a sense of coexistence, that somehow, when looking at beauty, which was also part of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher and ethicist idea, people can be united. People can agree on what is beautiful, and that beauty can bring perspective and can bring people together. Again, to some extent, that reflects a wish. It's an idealization. All of these are idealizations. All of these are partial. And I think that's important to keep in mind. But there are all ways of trying to find some perspective which allows one to see long term and allows one to slowly, as in bring people together the way Henrik Epstein does symbolically here in the owl. Again, if you are not familiar with his work, I would very much encourage you to look at it. There's a museum in Haifa which has some of his work, which I just find outstanding. And there's right behind me is one of his paintings also that as one of my patients says, when I see her on Zoom now, she's a Holocaust survivor. She says, it always reassures me to go ahead and to see that painting in back of you, because it's like I feel like I'm in your office again. That's the painting right behind me there. I don't know. It's there we go. Maybe show it a little bit more. So, but again, here it's a still life, but it's a still life which has 2 vases, a big one and a small one, perhaps reflecting parent-child issues and separation issues, and the different levels of development, different flowers at different stages of life. So that's Henrik Epstein. Now, having said this, I mentioned Lodz, which is where I was born. This is and resilience. On the left is a photograph of the fecalists, whose average lifespan was 6 months because they would die of typhus and other diseases otherwise in the Lodz ghetto. But they were able to go ahead and maintain the Lodz ghetto from being liquidated until 1944. And they were able to fight a pandemic, the typhus pandemic, successfully through sanitation measures. They also formed the corridor resistance. This person is my mom. My dad is somewhere in the background, and he was one of the leaders of the resistance. He was much more reluctant to be captured on film, even by a member of the resistance, especially was taken by the resistance. But cohesion, people were able to, and very different people. Some of these people were extraordinary, came from the very best families, including the wealthiest families, most intellectual families, philosophers, who were condemned to this fecalist battalion because they refused to be policemen. My father refused to be a policeman, so he was condemned here. Other people came from all walks of life. My mother's father was a master furniture maker, but they all cohered together to create an underground shelter, the ghetto, where eventually, and this is on the right here is a Turner watercolor called The Ghetto in Monknash, Wales. Wales is one of my favorite places to visit, by the way, where people were able to go ahead and continue to resist. And eventually emerged 77 years to this date. So cohesion and solidarity in the face of extreme circumstances is all the more vital now than before, which doesn't mean agreeing with each other, but being able to respect each other's dignity and each other's differences. To quote Oscar Wilde, we are all in the ghetto, but some of us are looking up at the stars. So that's the challenge for us today, how to go ahead and to continue to look up at the stars, even in the ghettos of yet another wave of COVID. And again, that doesn't mean going into denial, but it does mean recognizing that vaccines matter, boosters matter. Recently, several patients who I've had have tested positive for COVID. Some of them have had huge risk factors, such as steroid-dependent asthma. They all did well because they had boosters. They were vaccinated. Just because vaccines and boosters do not go ahead and keep people from being infected necessarily. They do reduce the rate of infection, the rate of infectability, the rate of getting sick seriously, being hospitalized and dying. So again, we have to move away from perfection to be able to achieve this kind of the kind of cohesion that we very much need right now. And we also need to go ahead and pay attention to our dreams as dreams and to be able to interpret them. It doesn't mean taking our dreams concretely, but here is a earlier etching from Rembrandt. This is when before he suffered all of his losses, where Joseph is interpreting in dreams while he's in prison and he's facing certain death. Now, what message is Rembrandt trying to go ahead and say to both himself and to us? That it's important, even in the midst of tragedy, of fear, of impending loss, not to be able to pay attention to one's dreams, both literally and figuratively, and to be able to interpret them and to recognize them. Here, what Joseph eventually told the Pharaoh was that there would be seven. The Pharaoh had a dream of seven fat cows followed by seven lean cows. So he held about Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, so he pulled him from prison, and he proceeded to ask him, what does this mean? And Joseph did, remember when we talked about time and how important time and perspective was? He put it in perspective. He said, the seven fat cows represent, which came first, represent current reality. We are in the midst of plenty. But my Pharaoh, that's only going to last for 7 years. After that, there will be 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh took that seriously enough to stockpile food during the 7 years of plenty to be able to go ahead and safeguard Egypt from famine during the 7 years that the Nile River was running dry. In the midst of climate change, this doesn't sound so far-fetched, by the way, even today. It still sounds relevant today. Well, that's literal. But we also have to go ahead and safeguard the plenty, the feast that life brings us in terms of memories, in terms of experiences we have. against the famines which come at times with aging as we get older, with social events such as this pandemic, or with biological events such as when we become less capable of doing now what we used to be able to do. So how do we safeguard that? Again, Rembrandt's answer is you have to pay attention and interpret your dreams, either dreams figuratively or literally. And he continued with this. You can see in 1639, one of his favorite poses, this is Rembrandt again, is of the man who seems to be sad, but he's holding on to his hat, a little bit like the rabbi's holding on to the Torah. By the way, one of Bloom's favorite uh, painters was, of course, Rembrandt. Another one was Turner. So I'm proceeding into turn here. And here is a 1871 painting by Sargent of a Roman slave laundress. And this is just after the Civil War. It's an early Sargent, where even though slavery has been abolished in the United States, it still exists in other places. In the United States, racism and slavery never, even if they went away literally, they never went away figuratively. But again, what even the slave is doing in the midst of her slavery is she's holding on to her head. She will not lose her head to racism. She will not lose her head to slavery. There's a dignity there. There's a sense of agency there that she's not willing to give up, and that Sargent um, shows. At the same time, when there's too much coming down on our heads, how can we lighten the load? I think that's a vital question. Again, one of the ways of lightening the load and keeping things in perspective is art, which again, hopefully moves us more towards ethical and bioethical resilience without denial, without scapegoating, rather than the toxic resilience which includes counterphobic behavior, scapegoating. Now, Rembrandt himself, as I had mentioned, was no stranger to illness and to grief and loss. This is a portrait of Hendrik Stoeffels. She was his housekeeper, who after the death of his first wife became basically his agent, his lover, the person who managed his life until she also was taken far too early. What he did was he went ahead and he proceeded to take Dürer's, and again, Dürer was one of Rembrandt's favorites, so we have a lineage here. And he proceeded to depict her and create a painting of her in life, a painting which he could go ahead and reflect on, and other people he could share her with, so he would not be so alone. And this is very much in keeping with one of the take-home lessons from Dürer, which was anyone who's among us today may be buried tomorrow. What did my parents do? That's my mother and father in 1946. Once they got out of the gutter, the underground Brücke in the Lodz ghetto, where they had survived the resistance group. Well, my father very quickly recognized that what was important to my mother was a way of remembering her own mother. So they went to the cemetery, they found a destroyed tombstone, and they restored it. So believe it or not, this is August of, I believe, 1946, a year and they restored this tombstone. It's a place where my mother could go ahead and grieve, but she could also acknowledge her mother's death, but still go on with her life. Oops, let's see. So I have a slew of clinical case examples, but as I've been warned already, I have gone as much into my talk and while leaving some room for questions as I can. So if anyone has questions, please one at a time, unmute yourself questions and comments are more than welcome. But let me begin with Tom, who, as always, continues to be my teacher. Tom, what are your thoughts? And unmute yourself, please. You're still not unmuted. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, here we go.
Oh, yes.
All right,
There
thank
you
you. Yeah, your examples I thought were very powerful and reminded me of an article by Hilda Bloom, no relation to Hyman Bloom, an article called "How Did They Survive?" And it was a comment that begins with the line, "Death in a German concentration camp requires no explanation. Survival does." And she reports this incident where the people were sort of sitting around the yard inside the camp, and one of the people there was a retired professor, and they asked him to give a lecture on existentialism, and he did. And the people there afterwards thanked him with tears in their eyes that for a brief period of time they were human and not just imprisoned and sentenced to death. So I think your notion of the culture and arts being a way of surviving enormous agony, fear, grief, and helplessness. So I thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for our ongoing conversation over the decades. All right, I think you can raise your hands. I may be able even to call on you here, but if that's not working, then just if you have a comment or a question, please unmute yourself. But do it one at a time. So if someone else is talking, stay muted.
If you know how to use the little yellow hand thing,
Yes.
please do that because it brings you up to the top of the queue.
Yeah. I'm going to also. Okay. Well, I may have left most people speechless.
You have a question. You have a
Actually,
question from Donna.
Oh, good. Please, Donna, go ahead. Thank you, Tom. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Harold. It was a lovely presentation. I particularly appreciated your references, not only historically, but more contemporarily to what we're facing today in terms of difficulties related to race relations, the COVID epidemic. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. Again, it's a transgenerational beat that continues. The pandemic tends to perhaps compound it and amplify it.
Mm.
But the stream is there, the waves are there, and the pandemic increases the amplitude in a fundamental way. Um, how can we, the, I always ask myself the question: how can one address this both on an individual basis, with patients, in the community? What are your thoughts, Donna?
Well, I particularly am struggling over the issue of how to keep this more future oriented. And I think that's what your presentation did. I think to have an appreciation of history, but also to have hope and looking forward to what is possible, particularly when people are aligned together in working for the good. And I think right now, our society is so divided. We see, if anything, we hear more about the negative parts of
Mm-hmm.
our society than we do about what we can do together to empower us as a people. So I think that is so critical. And I'm particularly impressed by young people because I think they haven't been so staled or really negatively impacted in the way they still have hope. They're still more energetic. And I think that's made a big difference in our society. So thank you so much. I'm appreciative. I'm just struck by the fact that you are presenting art. Cash did an art piece, and
Yes.
I really think there's a place for that and I'm looking at it in terms of my own presentation, because I think that really does speak to the issue of hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. It very much does. Again, art can give us perspective, which means, and by remembering history, we are not condemned to repeat it, right? That's where the hope is. That's, again, I'm stealing from Georges Santayana, who used to teach philosophy over here, but and who himself was a bit of a fascist, by the way. Yes, who's perfect? But yeah, I mean, part of the problem is in the midst of grief and fear, we all experience the seduction of a foreshortened future. That somehow that the future is now. This is it, uh, and there's there's either no future, only the immediate future, or there. But very often, part of that is also a denial of the past. By denying the temporal sequence, past, present, future, by being overly present, as as one very twist goes of new agey stuff. Uh,
Oh,
you know that
oh,
sometimes being over. Yeah, I'm reminded of uh, something which a long time teacher and friend at Mass Mentor, Max Day, used to say to us residents when we would go ahead and do the residency. For those residents who would come late, he would say, "You must be feeling very anxious." For those residents who came early, he would say, "You must be feeling very anxious." And guess what he would say to those residents who came just on time? "You must be feeling very anxious." So again, that temporal we have to acknowledge it. We are all feeling very anxious, and which expands the time horizon in all directions, rather than simply cutting it down to the bare bones present. Uh, 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 so again, I think that's absolutely vital.
Okay, well, Juan has a question.
Please.
yeah. Thank you, Harold. Your illustrations are definitely a plus. You didn't have to use many words except identify what the paintings were saying. And I think your last point there was the point throughout. It is that moment that no matter what is going on, it is that moment, whether it be in one painting or in another painting, whether it be one theme or another, that it is that moment that really stays alive. And in spite of all the darkness and uncertainty, it's making that moment remain alive and bright. I think you did a very good job of that. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Juan. And you remind me that still lifes are never still.
Yes, precisely.
Mhm. Other uh, thoughts, comments, questions, musings? Uh, I guess, unless, again, feel free to interrupt me as we all know. But in terms of the clinical vignettes, and I have collected them, a series of them, of what, what happens between patients and clinicians during the pandemic. Uh, One thing which often happens is when people have to reschedule, there's been more rescheduling than usual. The reason is that there's more uncertainty in life. People don't quite have the habits, the routines. Uh, what I have found very, very helpful is to go ahead and to explore what does it mean to to change a time. And whenever possible, I find it very, very helpful to go ahead and give patients a choice of a couple. One, if I can, I mean, if I can't, I can't. But when it comes to rescheduling, to go ahead and present not an endless set, but a couple of choices to patients about rescheduling, or even saying, "Do you want to skip and we can just go ahead and meet next week instead?" Because the sense of helplessness in the midst of the pandemic, I think is that much deeper than I have seen it over time. So any choices that we can create and allow patients' agency to be exercised and patients' dignity to be maintained is vital. There are some patients who will, so for example, one patient who is, absolutely, brilliant, talented, uh, 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 person, just at the height of, she received every accolade in her profession that anyone can receive. But all of a sudden, she feels at this point that she depends that much more on me. So recognizing that and saying, well, what does this mean to her? And can she maintain her own sense of dignity and her own sense of empowerment, agency, even if she says, I really benefit from meeting with you more than once a week now. I like to meet twice a week. Um, uh, how to go ahead and to be able to have her say that without feeling ashamed or humiliated or mortified in the process, when it's so natural to do that when you're feeling a sense of loss and grief. And she says how she's had some losses in this pandemic as well. So being sensitive to that.
Right. So just to reflect in a kind of retrospective notion about the presentation we've just had, which I feel is exceptional, the perspective idea is critical. The present situation, I think, shows us many more examples of toxic adaptation, regression, paranoia, blaming, displacements, and so forth. And there's no limit to what emerges. For example, that the idea that the vaccines contain little tracking devices that Bill Gates is going to use to find you, whatever value that may have. But anyway, let's hear it for the light in the darkness, one piece of which light you have been able to share with us. So our thanks.
And my thanks to you. I look forward to all of our conversations continuing. So thank you again.
Okay, so
Thank
officially,
you, Harold. Thank you.
officially, Grand Rounds is over, and whoever's host can put the thing in.